And Brian has over 30 years of experience working on First Nations business and economic development issues as an elected First Nations leader, as well as a chief executive officer, executive director, manager, management consultant, and employee in both the public and private sectors. Much of his experience is focused in Northern Ontario in the resource sector, infrastructure development and financing, and he presently is the ED of the Anishinaabe Development Fund. In the past, Brian has worked for Matawa First Nations Management, First Nations Equity, Economic Renewal Initiative, and the Anishinaabe Nation, including working as a private consultant. Brian is going to be our third speaker today. I'm going to introduce first Michael Denham, who is the president and CEO of BDC. And thank you, Michael, for joining us. Michael is the president and CEO of BDC, as mentioned, which is Canada's only bank devoted exclusively to entrepreneurs. So that is pretty exciting. He leads a team of 2,200 people across Canada who work every day to help entrepreneurs succeed by providing the guidance and financial support they need to build resilient, growing businesses. A strong advocate for entrepreneurship and innovation, Mr. Denham drives BDC's positioning as the #1 ally of Canadian entrepreneurs. Having more impact on more business owners and being as easy as possible to do business with are among his main priorities at the helm of BDC. A seasoned business leader with more than 30 years of senior management experience, Mr. Denham held senior roles at McKinsey, Bombardier, Accenture, and Aquaterra before joining BDC. He's based in Montreal since 2001 and is bilingual and holds a Bachelor of Arts from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, as well as a Master's of Science in Economics with distinction from the London School of Economics. So Michael will be our first panelist. I'm going to invite Keith Martel as our second panelist. And Keith is the CEO of First Nations Bank of Canada. Mr. Martel is a director, president, and CEO of First Nations Bank Canada. He was involved in the creation of the bank and has been on the board of directors since 1996. Wealth of experience. He graduated from the University of Saskatchewan in '85 with a Bachelor of Commerce and received an honorary Doctor of Laws from the same institution in 2016. After 10 years with the chartered accounting firm KPMG, he served the Federal of Saskatchewan Indian Nations as the ED of Finance and Fiscal Relations from '95 to 2000. Mr. Martel is a chartered professional accountant and a certified Aboriginal financial manager. He is a director of Nutrien and River Cree Enterprises GP Limited. He chairs the board of trustees of the National Indian Brotherhood Trust, and he resides in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. So that is the introduction of our three panelists. Let's give them a round of applause and invite Michael Denham to be our first speaker, followed by Keith Martel, and finally with Brian Davey. Thank you.
Ian, thanks very much. I know it's important to you to make sure we have time for questions afterwards, so I'll do my best to get us back on schedule. So it's good to be here, and as you know, we're speaking on unceded Algonquin land, and I do want to acknowledge the Algonquin, Anishinaabe, and the care they've provided over the years for the territories and the land and the water of this area. Now, my starting point for today's discussion is actually very similar to what we heard from Adam, and from Don, and from Shannon. That is, we see an enormous economic opportunity tapping into the potential of Indigenous entrepreneurs, and we see the same issue around access to capital and insufficient capital. Back in 2007, we, with NACA, BDC and NACA, together sponsored some research that the Conference Board of Canada did, looking at the economic landscape, the economic ecosystem, to use that word, as it relates to Indigenous entrepreneurs. And there were a bunch of findings in it, but the two that really struck me were the following. The first is that the number of Indigenous entrepreneurs are growing, as we just saw. The number and size of AFIs are also growing due to the growing number of young Indigenous population, due to the increased size of projects across the country, and also due to the increasing kind of complexity and demands of the AFI clientele. So that's kind of point one that stuck with me. And point two is that the AFI network, and we just heard this, which plays such a unique and important role in this economic landscape, is undercapitalized and doesn't have the means to serve the range of this need as you'd all like. And then the report also went on to cite all sorts of examples of entrepreneurs having difficulty accessing financing. And from the work that we've done and seen, almost 45% of Indigenous entrepreneurs say that accessing loans, lending financing, is a major obstacle to their growth. And almost a third indicate that not being able to access equity is an important obstacle to their growth. So all that to say, I'm just very pleased that we're here all together today and tomorrow to talk about this as a challenge of making sure we get more financing brought to bear to support the needs and the growth of Indigenous entrepreneurs. So BDC is dedicated to inclusive economic growth. We have about 60,000 odd clients across the country. And for these clients, we provide loans, we make investments, we're actually a large, especially venture capital equity investor, and we provide consulting or advisory services. And the way we work with Indigenous entrepreneurs is similar, but we have tailored what we do to reflect the specific needs of this community. And I hope that you all in this room, AFIs, entrepreneurs, folks that are active and play a key role in the ecosystem, do view us as a key partner in trying to get more capital brought to bear to help entrepreneurs. And we try to do this in a number of ways. The first is we do have a dedicated business unit within BDC. It's called the Indigenous Business Unit. It's a cross-country business unit. We've got 9 folks serving Indigenous entrepreneurs across the country. They're passionate about helping Indigenous entrepreneurs grow. And so far we have about 630 Indigenous clients and in excess of $300 million invested as loans in this part of our portfolio. The second thing is we have a specific lending product that is designed for Indigenous entrepreneurs, and it's called the Indigenous Entrepreneur Loan. And it allows us to lend up to $250,000 to Indigenous entrepreneurs, up to $150,000 if it's a startup, and it's applicable both for on-reserve and off-reserve lending. Thirdly, advisory services. As we saw from Adam's analysis, Indigenous entrepreneurs are all across the country and are disproportionately located in rural as opposed to urban locations. We've put in place an advisory services capability so we can connect the advice of our consultants to entrepreneurs regardless of where they work and where they sit. So we're using technology to connect the advice we offer to Indigenous entrepreneurs. And then lastly, we have a partnership with the CPA, the Chartered Professional Accountants Association of Canada, to deliver financial literacy sessions to Indigenous entrepreneurs. And I think over the course of the past 2 years, we've had a couple of hundred of these entrepreneurs work with the CPA and us to up the financial literacy. So all that to say, we've been doing what we think is a lot so far. But what I'd like to do is to share with you some of the things that we hope to do in the future, give you a sense of what our priorities are. And I do want to make sure that what I want to underscore is that we remain committed, frankly, more committed than ever to make sure we bring to bear the capital that we have access to. And as evidence of that, we had a board meeting last month in Vancouver, and one of the themes of the board meeting was the support the BDC can provide to Indigenous entrepreneurs. So we had 3 of our clients from BC come talk to us about their businesses, their challenges, their needs, and that teed up a whole fascinating discussion that we had with them and with the full board over dinner around this part of the Canadian economy and what BDC should be aspiring to do. So there are 3 things we want to do going forward. First, we want to make sure we continue working and do our best to work well with AFIs across the country. We think that partnering has been successful and can be very successful. And for example, with many client situations, we'll work together. And BDC will take on, say, the working capital part of the loan, the partner AFI will take on the equipment part of the loan, and together we work to fulfill the broad set of needs that the client has. When project costs are high, in some cases clients are looking for $500,000 or more. For some AFIs in the room, it's hard to lend that much. View us as your partner. We can kind of fill the remaining amount and work with you jointly to support that client. And at a grassroots level, what we find increasingly is that our clients, our entrepreneurs, really value a discussion whereby they get themselves, BDC, the relevant AFI, and their charter bank together around the same table to focus on their business. So increasingly, as part of our annual reviews with clients, they'll orchestrate that discussion, get all the financial partners together to understand the roadmap, so we can each play our roles and help the client with the financing they need to grow. Secondly, we do want to provide more capacity overall to the AFI network. And I just want to say that Shannon and his team have been working tirelessly with us and with others to bring to life the Indigenous Growth Fund. And we hope that, I guess in the months and weeks ahead, we'll continue to work together and hopefully combine forces to deliver more financial capacity to AFIs and most importantly, to Indigenous entrepreneurs. And then thirdly, we want to work more with women entrepreneurs. And this is a big priority for BDC writ large. We now have the largest of its kind in the world venture capital equity fund investing in women. We've committed to double the size of our overall lending book to $1.4 billion in the next couple of years to support women entrepreneurs. And that strategy translates itself also into specific priorities to support female Indigenous entrepreneurs. And one thing we're proud of is over the course of the past few months, we've had 15, we call them boot camps, take place across the country, where we're providing some tools and some training to women entrepreneurs. And of these 15, we had 2 that were dedicated exclusively to women Indigenous entrepreneurs, one in Saskatoon, one here. And it was beneficial not just in terms of the skills and the capabilities that got imparted, but also in terms of the networking and support that resulted from the session. So we're going to continue to do our best as well to support women Indigenous entrepreneurs. So look, we are thrilled to be here today, thrilled to be a sponsor. We view ourselves as your partner with the goal of helping Indigenous entrepreneurs get access to what they need to grow and improve and succeed. And the starting point for us in all of this is a basic, simple truth. And that is, when Indigenous entrepreneurs succeed, when all Canadian entrepreneurs succeed, the whole country succeeds. And that's what we're all about. So thanks very much, and look forward to any questions you have afterwards.
Good morning. As mentioned, I'm Keith Martell. I'm the CEO and President of First Nations Bank of Canada, and I'm glad to be here this morning to give you my perspective on the changing landscape of financing and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis economic development. I am from the Waterhen Lake First Nation in Saskatchewan, and I've been working with First Nations in some capacity, either at the chartered accounting firm or with the bank over the last 25, 30 years. It seems to be sort of a theme up here with Brian and Don. I didn't realize Don started in business in elementary school, but 30 years is a long time to be working with First Nations, and we've seen a lot of development over the last 30 years. Our bank is a chartered bank. We're one of the 2 Indigenous-owned financial institutions in Canada with Peace Hills Trust, who's a trust company owned by the Samson First Nation in Alberta. Our bank is 83% Indigenous owned, with both Inuit and First Nation shareholders owning a vast majority of the bank. And we've grown to approximately $600 million in assets. And I mentioned to a couple of people this morning, we've actually doubled our size since 2012. So the growth is just becoming exponential, and the deals are getting larger and the opportunities are getting more complex. And so it's important that we understand what that means for financing. 90% of our commercial lending is to Indigenous business in one form or fashion, both First Nations Economic Development Enterprise, First Nations governments, Inuit regional organizations, and individual entrepreneurs. Our business is rooted in the Aboriginal Capital Corporation movement. Our founding shareholder was the Saskatchewan Indian Equity Foundation, who was I think there's always a debate about who was the first ACC in Canada, but we in Saskatchewan say Saskatchewan Indian Equity was the first ACC in Canada. And it really taught us the opportunity to help grow Indigenous business and how growth leads to other opportunities. And I still think there is a firm need for the AFI network as complexity of financing grows, for the AFI to continue to feed the stock that is going to become the commercial lending of the future. So in the big picture of what I've observed over the last 25, 30 years in Indigenous business, I think that the first thing is much of what Don and others have talked about. It's the growing complexity of the type of business developments that are occurring. In the early days, most of the businesses being developed in First Nations communities was really local, and it was a replacement for a service or good that was already being provided to the community by typically a non-Indigenous business person. My dad's starting business came when he bought buses to bus kids to school, because typically before that, the buses in our community were owned by non-Indigenous farmers from around our First Nation who would come onto our community, bus our kids, get paid, and none of that economic development, none of that business stayed in our community. I don't think there's any First Nations in Canada today who don't have local entrepreneurs who own the buses. It's a core startup business in the communities, and it's one of the first businesses that got started in most of our communities. That led to other opportunities to buy the local store, to buy the local logging supply company, to buy the local water truck. All those kind of businesses were typically local, typically small, and typically supported by the local economic development arm of the First Nations government. That business has continued to grow in size and complexity, and that's led to a need for different, larger, and a growing spectrum of financing to service and support the business growth. So what happens with financing when a business grows? Well, first of all, you need more financing. So it means you need more equity to support more commercial debt or other forms of financing in order to get your business off the ground. When we went from typically businesses that were owned by one community in one region, the business was relatively simple. With the advent of tribal councils and regional organizations, the complexity and the scope of the business changed significantly. And I think it was really odd that you find stories where we surprised other people and other governments with the growth of our business. And I talked to the chair of our board, Bill Namagoose, who's the Director General of the James Bay Cree. They settled a large claim, as many of you know, around the hydro developments in Quebec. And one of the first assets they decided they wanted to buy was a local airline service that was servicing their communities, and they felt they had an opportunity to buy, just like the buses, a local service that serviced their need. The Premier of Quebec told the James Bay Cree that Crees can't own an airlines. And they asked, why can't we own an airlines? And he said, because you shouldn't own a business. And it's just sort of that mindset. And that wasn't very long ago. That was really the late 70s, early 80s. But those businesses have developed into very large, complex businesses. They finance airplanes with vendor financing. They finance their core operations with various types of financing from banks and bonds and other forms of financing. The first businesses often, after the local business, was often turnkey opportunities. These were where a local oil company or oil service industry company decided they actually needed an Aboriginal partner in order to get contracts. And this is where industry, specifically mining, forestry, and oil and gas development, saw that there was an opportunity to advance their land requirements by having the First Nations on side. These turnkey operations were often great opportunities for the First Nation to get into a business where they didn't have the capacity to operate the business wholly by themselves. But those opportunities were typically financed by your partner, run by your partner, and controlled by your partner. While these were good opportunities to start, our First Nations communities quickly outgrew these opportunities and either bought out their turnkey partner or hived off of that and started to be a competitor for the partner they originally started business with. And that's just good business. You find often in non-Indigenous business where your top employee, your top manager, your top subcontractor becomes your competitor as they grow, expand, and continue to grow up the continuum of business development. So what's happened to the need for financing as the complexity of our businesses has grown? The complexity of our capital has grown. The need for an ACC to provide equity lending, equity grants, and business startup lending was pretty much all that was needed in the very early stages of Aboriginal economic development. But that's grown significantly. As the equity in those businesses grow and is owned by the entrepreneur themselves or the First Nation themselves through either savings, earnings, or the settlement of trusts that gave a lot of the First Nations the capital they needed, they were going to more and more commercial lenders. Or some ACCs continue to do lending to larger and larger businesses. There wasn't as much developmental lending anymore, but was really commercial lending. These businesses continue to grow, and I've been involved in dozens of projects in Canada that have used some very complex capital structures, including structured debt, private bond issues, subordinated debt, mezzanine financing, in order to get into businesses in the electrical generation, transmission, casinos, large hotels, regional airlines, a number of other businesses which are growing in size and complexity. So the early days where ACC lending, a little bit of commercial lending, maybe some government support was sufficient. Today, our communities and our entrepreneurs need the whole spectrum of the capital continuum, right from grants to private and public equity. We play in virtually the whole stream of the capital continuum now, but there are a couple exceptions where we haven't started to play yet. We have continued to need ACCs to support economic development and business development because, as was mentioned in the great numbers that were provided by the Conference Board, the need for development of Aboriginal entrepreneurs, the need for the employment growth is still there. Even though we're making these significant gains in the number of entrepreneurs, the number of employees, the number of professionals, we still are vastly underrepresented in most of those areas. And as that need continues to grow, and frankly, as the continuum of our businesses begins to rise, the need at the developmental level grows even larger. Because as our businesses not only become turnkey partners, but become the owner of that oil service industry business, or the owner of that casino hotel, or the owner of that trucking distribution network, it grows the need for the young, typically women entrepreneurs in that local community, to serve the need of that larger Indigenous-owned business. And so that doesn't eliminate the need for AFIs, it actually makes the AFIs more and more relevant to the continuing growing need of the Aboriginal Indigenous business across the whole spectrum. We are continuing to grow in some of the aspects of government non-bank supported lending. Export Development Canada has been involved in a number of deals for our customers in the last year, for businesses that are exporting around the world. Farm Credit Corporation is beginning to look at Indigenous business to support farming and growing farming businesses in First Nations communities. And BDC, as is mentioned, is a growing partner in many of the entrepreneurial developments in First Nations communities. Our communities are still not taking advantage of the public equity spectrum, the far right side of the equity spectrum. But I believe there's a handful of businesses that are growing in size and complexity, and that they're not far off from doing a public bond issue or a public offering in order to raise capital to continue to grow their business. So in conclusion, I just think that the capital needs are growing in complexity because the type of business opportunities that we're investing in are growing in complexity. And the growing need and the growing development of the need for capital just means we got to do more and more at the grassroots to keep feeding the network that's going to continue to lead to economic prosperity and economic success for the individual entrepreneur and the individual employee and the individual owner of the businesses in our communities. And I'd be happy to answer the questions later in the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. But in my early 20s, when I was I was already finishing a couple of years of university, my dad, I got to go home during Christmas and in the breaks, and I lived in a small community called Moose Factory, Ontario. Moose Cree First Nations, my band affiliation. Then we were talking about money one time and several times. And he said, I don't understand this government. I can't understand why they say they have no money. He says, why can't they just print the stuff? And it will resolve all the financial problems. I said, after 2 years in university, I thought I knew something. And I said, you don't do it that way. It's got to be attached to something. well, at that time it was no longer attached to gold, that got decoupled in 71 or 72, something like that. But I said, it's got to be supported by something. And he says, I don't understand that. They got this big printing press there somewhere in Ottawa. I'm sure they can print the damn money all they want. So anyway, I said, well, I'm not going to argue. I don't think I'm going to win this argument. So I just left it at that. But 30 years later, I begin to realize, hey, he had a point. He had a point. And because when we started in '87 as an EDF, an Aboriginal financial institution, and I look at today, I think we've only put out $45 million in loans. And I hear my good friend speak, and he started in '96, and I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars that they've already put out in loans. So I said, here, something is very, very wrong. So obviously we're running out of capital. Our financial manager said, here's the cash flow. Brian, if we continue to do these large loans with some of these applicants that are coming in, we're gonna run out. Where are we going to get the money from? As you know, in our, well, this isn't applied to you, but in Northern Ontario right now, they have these large infrastructure projects like transmission lines, all-season roads, potential mining up to 400 million in set-asides for First Nation, Aboriginal, Indigenous businesses. So it's a lot of money, it's a lot of projects, and and we have clients that have been with us since day one through the grant process, and they've evolved, and they've got into smaller loans with us. Now they're coming back for bigger loans. They don't want to go anywhere else. They like these relationships that have been developed. They want to stick with them. They don't want to go anywhere else. But NADF doesn't have the capacity to meet. So we said, well, let's do a study. Let's find out if banks are willing to loan to us, so we can, take the spread or take a little fee. And so we did a study. We talked to several banks. We did a feasibility study. We went out to various lenders and even equity funds, pension funds, and all the banks said, well, if you increase the guarantee, if you can get the guarantee from the government, oh yeah, we'll provide you the support that you needed. And that support diminished as the guarantee. We had a survey said if the federal government guaranteed 20%, 40%, 50%, 60%. Obviously, the support grew from the lending sector as the guarantee was put in there. But, I was thinking, geez, there's got to be a better way. There was a gentleman that talked about the Harvard study yesterday about some of the things that are missing is our institutional building. And one of the strongest advocates that I've read or heard of is amongst my own people that I work with, and we need to look at something that allows us fractional reserve lending. Right back to my dad's point, creating money out of thin air. Banks, for every dollar they have, they can lend out 9 or 10 or 8. I get $1, I only can lend out $1. That's all we can do. That's all we can do. And that's got to change, and it takes legislation to change that. Maybe we're talking about Indigenous Business Bank of Canada Act that can give us a different way of accessing capital. Or we could have legislative changes that allows for nonprofit AFIs to have that authority for fractional reserve lending. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but we need to take We need to look at a sustainable solution that will take us into the future. We don't have that now because we can go to the government with our hand out and hat in hand and say, we need some more capital going forward for the next 5 years. We're tapped out. They may give us $100 million, but we're right back to the government again after 5 years. So we gave it all out again. Sorry, we can't live off the repayments, and these loans are getting larger and larger. So I'm not saying that we don't want to work with the other lenders. Of course we want to. We want to be involved with those other lenders as well. But there's something about relationships that we can't walk away from. And that's working with our own people and helping them become prosperous people, communities of the communities we all come from. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to our panelists. There's a lot of nuggets here to build upon, and a lot goes through my mind in listening to the three gentlemen about their experience, what's working, what's not working, and where the next iterations of growth lie before us. It's incremental. When we look at the context of each of our generations, a lot of my parents, my grandparents were shut out of many of these sectors, and that culture of excellence was not instilled when it comes to how to compete or access capital. It was historically denied. When I look at even running for public office, that wasn't an option for my parents' era or my grandparents' era, where we weren't citizens in our own land. So as new entrants in the market, there is a lot of work before us to grapple with, and I look at the collective wealth of experience here. I think about my own predicaments on the West Coast, where we've negotiated in the last 20 years a number of major projects. We have created the space, whether it's in forestry or clean energy or other energy projects, with the signing of LNG last week. Some of the IBAs that we negotiated over multiple years. We've acquired a substantive land portfolio. So we're maturing when it comes to negotiating with the Crown or with the private sector, where, for example, we created our own environmental assessment on the wood fiber liquefied natural gas, and we issued our own legally binding conditions to the proponent. This was a way of moving towards consent beyond consultation to actualize UNDRIP and consent and the principles. But we have time before lunch, and I really wanted to start some of the dialogue and encourage you to approach the mics that are on the floor here. But really, I'm thinking of our entrepreneurs. When we've negotiated as nation to nation these opportunities built on rights and title, built on leveraging our land and our resources, and government's desire to issue rights to third-party interest atop of our rights and title and treaty rights, this becomes adversarial and a conflict. But we reframe. We look at new ways to move beyond competition over scarcity resources to a place of collaboration and finding that sweet spot where it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are many aspects of scale from our value chains when it comes to the entrepreneurs, subcontractors, where many of our members in our nations have taken risks. They have stepped forward and acquired machines or gotten involved in any aspect of value chains. But my anxiety where we currently are on the West Coast is who's going to occupy the field next. Everything is incremental growth. Now that we've created space, who is going to step in? And we are reliant on the joint ventures, the limited partnerships, because our members have not had the 10, 20, 30 years of scaling up and running business. We're reliant on partners where it is turnkey, where we can look to them to step in, where we provide opportunity, they provide expertise, and there's value, there's employment, there's metrics used to gauge performance. It must adhere to our values and principles as Indigenous people, where it's a good fit, and that goes back to the Harvard model, the Harvard projects. But I guess to start some of the questioning, seeing as we have about a half an hour, is how do we mobilize our members to move beyond the first iterations of partnerships to get them fully functioning and flourishing? And what is your vision for that? There are some microphones here. If I can invite some of our panelists to shed some light to help us where we are. And we see examples across the country from coast to coast to coast of where there is success, but there are also many barriers to enter the market. And I want to be able to mobilize and empower our members, our youth, to see themselves reflected in these businesses, that their values, that their aspirations are truly there, that we move beyond managing welfare, we manage wealth. Because there are many social issues that are prevalent in our communities, in every one of our families, and we must overcome those challenges. And the true measure of success isn't just affluence to become a millionaire or a billionaire, it's really the quality of life. And we know that many of our families still live in abject poverty, and that is unacceptable in 2019. So to truly move forward, I invite any of our panelists, help me understand the JVLP, the contract and procurement, the mobilization of our entrepreneurs in seeing metrics of success and moving that pendulum swing to the positive, if you can, please. And then following this, I invite any of our floor, please come forward. There are a couple microphones here. Use this opportunity to pick the brains of our professional friends here that have a wealth of experience. Thank you.
Use a northern Quebec example again. There's a family in one of the communities that owns 2 Tim Hortons franchise, and they continue to develop and grow their restaurant business. And you sort of say, well, how did that start? Did they go in and try and get a loan to start this Tim Hortons franchise? The story is they were the first family in that community to have a TV. And so everybody came to their house to watch TV. So the father bought an electric fry pan and started making food and selling it to people who came to watch his TV. And that sort of, so a frying pan leads to 2 Tim Hortons franchises. That's exactly the continuum I'm talking about. So we need that growth and development at the entrepreneur level. We need communities to start getting their core startup businesses right, and then growing them bigger, and then looking at the next thing, and then partnering with their neighbor. And I think that all starts with the work that they advise to, and BDC and other risk lenders. Because often the entrepreneur will say, and I do differ in some of these studies, the entrepreneur always says, well, I can't get a loan. And when you really scratch the surface, the entrepreneur doesn't have the equity to get a loan. There always is an equity component to commercial lending. And so often, you said that they either say they don't have equity or they can't get a loan. I think it's probably all about not having equity. And if they don't have equity, they can't get a loan. So you need to start by getting them that risk capital, that equity, getting them started on a continuum and continuing to grow their business. And if you look at the far end of the scale, I think the one thing we're really still missing is an indigenous private equity fund. So we've got tens of billions of dollars of capital under management from claims and trusts and everything. I'm the chair of the National Indian Brotherhood Trust, which is the residual residential school and claims money. We have $200 million, and we pay these high-priced asset managers to manage $200 million. And then on the other end of the scale, we get individual communities that are looking for private equities to buy regional airlines or an oil service company. And they pay a different private equity guy who probably gets some of their capital from our own trusts. They pay him to give him their money. And I think there's a need for us to start looking at taking some of our own capital and capitalizing some of these private equity opportunities that can really drive that higher end. But driving the higher end doesn't mean you ignore the bottom. It's a continuum. And if you don't continue to drive the whole cycle, we don't get the growth of entrepreneurs.
So the like 2. Okay, good. So I guess the other point I'd like to add to that is when we think about success level as what you described, it's almost a combination of 3 things. On one hand, you need the entrepreneur at the core who's kind of skilled and ambitious. Secondly, that entrepreneur needs to be kind of selling something that's distinctive that people want to buy. And then third, that entrepreneur needs access, to your point, to kind of uninterrupted access to all forms of capital based on their stage of growth as they grow. And when you kind of look at entrepreneurs who succeed, whether it's kind of globally or regionally, even locally, there's some sort of combination of those three things that are brought to bear. And I guess where we're focused is on the first dimension in terms of helping to make sure that, especially early stage entrepreneurs, have the financial literacy, the skill that they need to grow. But especially on the last of the points, which is uninterrupted access to capital. And Brian, you said something that Shannon and I had actually talked about over our many meetings in terms of having a sustainable access to something like a BDC to support Indigenous entrepreneurs. And then go back to when we started, which was 75 years ago. And we started with a relatively kind of small amount of government capital. And just over the years of smart investing, prudent lending, et cetera, our balance sheet kind of grew and grew and grew, so that now we're at a stage where we're kind of $30 billion in assets. It took a long time to get there. But the nice thing was, in your context, it would give you, an institution like that would give the means for being able to provide varied forms of financing, as Keith describes, in a way that allows you to kind of plan and sustain and provide as uninterrupted access to capital to entrepreneurs in your community. So it's an idea that I think is well worth pursuing and reflecting on. And certainly something that Shannon and I have talked about at length.
I'll just add one point. We also own a for-profit organization called Nagani. And to get around some of those very difficult questions about funding startups, it's very difficult. They don't have the cash flow to do loans. So what we do is we look at convertible debt, where after 6 or 12 months we look at a conversion. If they're not, and during the interim there's no payments for 6 or 12 months, and then it allows them to grow. Or if there's another investor that comes along that establishes market value for the shares, then we convert at that rate, perhaps at a discount. So there's different ways that we use for looking at startups, and the bigger problem that we still need to get around with respect to when we go into a community to support community-based corporations with our loan fund. A lot of the security is already taken up by the banks. Their revenue stream from their casinos. The general security agreements are already in play. It's very difficult for us to steer anything, so our rates are higher, which puts us at a very, to somewhat disadvantage because we're at a higher rate, of course.
Yeah, thank you for assisting me with some of the initial questions and debt service ratio for the nations. One of the concerns I have, again, and inviting you, please come forward to utilize this opportunity, but as our nations become affluent, wealth creation, wealth management, a lot of the danger in that is the complacency of our members, so to simply be passive beneficiaries, where the nations are doing partnerships or utilizing opportunities, whether it's on reserve or off reserve, where a lot of the revenues are being put back into our programs and services to improve the quality of life for our membership. There's also the per capita distribution that membership begin to expect some of that to flow to their individual pockets, which is a danger for complacency, as opposed to creating the structures to allow mechanisms for members to then enter the market, and whether it's subcontracting or whether it's the value chains in any aspect, it's really that start. And this isn't a bad problem to have, because we're seeing now the early iterations of where we can be. So creating that vision, creating the cohort, articulating our vision, and then demonstrating tangible results is what I'm hearing and seeing today, and especially in the response that we just received. So I do appreciate that.
I do agree that and I think that's exactly my point when I talked, is there's a continuum of need. And I think you're right. There is this complex need for larger and bigger financing, things like pipelines and other things. My only, I hear your point about, the big institutions, they don't want to really let us in. I think money talks, and deals get done when the right deal is there. And I think that our communities, and I've seen dozens and dozens of examples where First Nations can do things they were told they couldn't do if they just get the right advice, stick with the rules, get the equity, and do the work. But I think the bigger need right now in my mind is back to the entrepreneur, the individual level. It goes to your poverty issue. You see some of the most prosperous First Nations in Canada who are still managing poverty at the community level. And it's because a lot of our assets are being managed in New York and London and Toronto and everywhere else in the world. And there's a lot of money coming in at the top, but it's still, the individual is still on social assistance or other things. I think the biggest payback that we could have as a collective group of people interested in our communities is develop more individual entrepreneurs. And I was talking at the Chamber of Commerce one time, and they said, you know, First Nations people, they own everything collectively. You don't have a history of entrepreneurship. And that's absolutely wrong. And that's a myth that we need to get over because, you know, if you think about the fur trade, every one of those fur traders was an entrepreneur. They ran their own business. They did their own marketing. They did their own production. They did everything from beginning to end. And they were self-contained businesses. And so we need to get back to that idea that our individuals, our families in the community can own a business, that it doesn't have to be owned by the First Nation or the ECDEV Corp.
Shall I go first? So for us, again, we're a Crown corporation. Our mandate is to help entrepreneurs, and a big part of our mandate is to make sure that all entrepreneurs have access to the resources and capital that they need. So this is, and we don't measure our success in terms of our bottom line financial performance. We measure our success in terms of the extent to which we fulfill that mandate. So we look at things like, and Monica James will be leading one of the panel, is involved in panel discussion this afternoon. She can elaborate on this. But we look at things as like the number of Indigenous entrepreneurs we're working with. We look at the number of transactions we do with partners, and the scorecard that we keep internally that we use to measure our own performance has, and what I'm committed to. On behalf of BDC vis-a-vis the shareholder, includes metrics like these. So partnerships count, number of Indigenous entrepreneurs counts, the size of the portfolio counts. So the more activity we can do in partnership with others, the better our metrics look internally.
So I'll answer two ways that I think the first is much like you mentioned, is it's joint development on opportunities. So where there's an opportunity where the entrepreneur needs a little bit more equity in risk lending and the commercial bank's willing to come into the deal, and we do dozens and dozens of these at any given time, where we're involved with a loan to an entrepreneur, First Nation, or a community ECDEV Corp, where the AFI is playing a role, maybe BDC is playing a role, and First Nations Bank playing a role. It could be all of the people on the spectrum playing a role. Then we each take our own individual part. We're sharing the revenue effectively. We're all getting paid our rightful rate for what we're providing, and the entrepreneur gets a product that meets their needs. So that's the one way I think AFIs can continue to play a role. The other one, which is going to make me not popular with the other chartered banks, is the Community Reinvestment Act idea. And that's a concept that the United States have, where, you know, if you're Bank of America and you don't really want to do business in small town Tennessee, but you rely on the American economy, you have to be in a position to provide equity to an organization that is going to provide financial services in small town Tennessee. It's called the Community Reinvestment Act, and banks have to put capital in there, and that capital then goes down to organizations like effectively AFIs or local banks, state banks, that do service those regions. So you can't be Bank of America and only do business in New York and LA and Denver. You have to do business in America. And that's a concept that, frankly, the Canadian government's always resisted. I'm not sure why. Maybe the large Canadian banks are better lobbyists. But it would provide some equity from lenders who participate in the Canadian economy, but don't participate on a proportional basis in First Nations, northern, remote communities.
Yeah. Banks can bring to the AFIs is that there should be more of a willingness on pari passu, like we're always being asked to take second, third positions, and there's got to be a willingness to work together and share in that risk, and that's going to have to happen more often.
What we're doing is, what I'm going to say isn't something that, the point about financial literacy isn't an Indigenous entrepreneurship. It applies to all entrepreneurs, regardless of where they're coming from. And what we're focused on is like fairly basic financial literacy. And through BDC.ca, we have a whole host of tools and articles We've gamified a lot of what we've been focusing on. So it's just a whole notion of basically how to start your business, how to manage it for cash, understand the fulfillment cycle, understand the procure-to-pay cycle in very kind of basic terms, so that as people take steps to grow their business, they're doing it in a way that is actually kind of cash flow positive rather than cash flow negative. So that's where we're focused. It's not to get people back to school. It's not to develop kind of deep expertise around a domain. It's to help largely early stage entrepreneurs just think in a basic level about how business works, how cash flow works, how cash management works, so they can make the right steps in the first few years to get to a sustainable point.
And I think it actually starts with basic literacy first. And I think I always encourage government that the best economic development program they could actually do, because they actually never do economic development very well for First Nations. They've never done it well. I think AFIs can claim for most of the success in economic development the government's ever supported, and it was done by the AFIs. But I think the thing that the government can really support to get financial literacy right is just get literacy right. Get K-12 done right. And if I don't care if the First Nation, the province, or the federal government's going to do it, but somebody has to get K-12 better delivered and effective to communities, because we look at a lot of the financial literacy products, and it's actually a literacy problem. It's not a financial literacy problem. And so we need to get K-12 right, because that's the best economic development opportunity we can create for the next generation.
One of the things that we do offer is bookkeeping workshops. They're usually small, and their focus currently at the moment, if I recall, is Sage 50. So we get about 10 people into the room. Some of them are entrepreneurs or ones that are working with the band offices, and it goes through 2 days of intense training, and we're finding it very helpful.